All right. Welcome, everyone. Sorry we're a few minutes late here. There were some technical hiccups, but there will be no hiccups moving forward with this great conversation on today's digital experience community cafe event, Visionaries of the Universal CMS. Today, we will focus on dotCMS and its origin, its product offering, and something called the Universal CMS. I'm Matthew McQueenie from Conabos, and also one of the inaugural, pardon me, members of the DX community MVPs. We do want to say if you have any thoughts or questions as we move along, please type them in the chat and we will surface them throughout. We love interactivity in this group. Joining us today is the handsome face we see here, Mr. Preston So, who is the Vice President of Product at dotCMS. And I will welcome you, Preston, but I'd like to first just give a quick word from our quote unquote sponsor, the digital experience community. For those involved, a really kind of thriving community. I think it's about a year and a half now that it's been up. Very inclusive, collaborative, agnostic, really bringing customers, partners, vendors, not overly salesy, looking to share knowledge and ideas about this vast digital experience world that we live in, and to really try to help people, right? And not just be, as I said, overly sales pitchy. And we're going to see today here a phenomenal conversation on something that's new. So, hello, Preston. Welcome again. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you up to this moment as VP of Product at dotCMS?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. And thanks, everyone, for your patience. I appreciate your time today. It's a real pleasure to be here on the DX Community Cafe session here today. And also, hello to everyone. My name is Preston So. I have worked in the software industry for about 20 to 25 years, and 17 of those years I've spent specifically in the content management space, in the digital experience space, on all sides of the equation, whether it's agency side, platform side, customer side, the list goes very long. My background is very interesting in that I started out way back in the day. My first content management system that I ever played with was actually Drupal in 2007. And it was just a really interesting time for the CMS world and the open source world as well. My background is primarily in open source, and from Drupal, I went on to work at places like Time Inc., working on PHP-based CMSs over there, both Drupal and WordPress. Then I went over to Acquia, where I joined the office of the CTO, working on the Acquia Labs skunkworks at Acquia up in Boston. And then from there, I went over to a lot of different other companies. I worked for Gatsby.js, which you might know as part of the Jamstack ecosystem, as well as Oracle, working on the Oracle content management system over there. And actually now this year, I joined dotCMS as VP of Product. But I'm also pretty, you might know me from my books as well. I've written 4 books. I used to be a columnist at CMS Wire, as well as an editor, I'm still an editor at A List Apart. And the 4 books I've written 2 coding manuals, Decoupled Drupal in Practice, basically about headless Drupal, as well as Gatsby, the definitive guide on Gatsby.js. And I've written 2 design books on content strategy and content design, namely voice content and usability and immersive content and usability.
Is that it? No, I'm just kidding. One fun one, like I like to ask with someone who's has such a breadth of experience in this. How many CMSs have you logged into?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would, well, okay. Do you mean CMS like instances? So like individual sites or
systems, right?
Systems. Different systems. So different products. Gosh, I mean, I would say probably upwards of 40 to 50 at this point. I mean, I remember way back in the day when I first started out with CMS, and this was even before my Drupal days, I was using stuff like movable type, expression engine, for those of you that remember. I was also using, just a lot of those sorts of tools. In the open source world, obviously, I've worked with Drupal and WordPress, but from then on, I've pretty much logged into every single headless CMS that exists that I could get a free trial for. I've definitely played around and have built sites on CMSs like Contentful, Sanity, HighGraph, Storyblock, Tina CMS, the list goes on, and Netlify CMS, which is now, I believe, named something different. What is it? Decap. So yeah, I mean, then I've also, believe it or not, I've also logged into many different CMSs that are either proprietary or homegrown. So those that were built internally within organizations, or also CMSs that my friends have built, or CMSs that my freelancer friends have built. So it's a very exciting thing to be able to look at just all of those different products and different ways that people solve the same problem.
So that's going to give us a great entry into our next question. But before I do that, as you sit now, we just released the Coniverse podcast with you as well this week, and that was at about a month into your time at dotCMS. How long is it now?
Well, yeah, it's I just hit actually as of today I just hit 120 days, so 4 months. Yeah, officially, yeah. Uh-huh.
Congratulations. So what is a day in the life for you like?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really good question. I would say that generally speaking, a day in the life for me consists of, first and foremost, okay, I'll share the day in the life for an ideal scenario. My optimal day in the life. Not to be too productivity hacky or so on and so forth, but I do try to get up pretty early. Actually, one of the things that folks may remember from that podcast episode is that I tend to wake up very early in the morning. I tend to wake up, I was waking up as early as 3:30 a.m. back in the COVID era. Nowadays, it's probably closer to around 4 or 5 a.m., maybe sometimes even 6 a.m. And the reason I do that is because I get my best work done in the morning. So I'll often go for a workout and then come back and, have a few hours of quiet time to do some writing. Writing is one of the things that I most enjoy doing in life. And back when I was writing my books, that's when I would write the biggest bulk of my, sort of book content and article content was during those early hours just after the sun rose. And then, gradually transitioning more and more into smaller and smaller content, I would, work on pieces of content I'm working on for work, thought leadership content or articles or blog posts, documentation or content more focused on developers. And then, of course, the workday starts. A lot of people don't know this, but when I was at Oracle, I would actually start my day at 7 a.m. and end at 3 p.m. So I was waking up even earlier than I do today. Today, I work a traditional 9-to-5 schedule. I think it's probably better for a lot of reasons. My workday starts, my workday ends, and then I try to be off pretty much by around, I would say 5:30, 6 p.m. Sometimes it goes a little later. I think a lot of people, depending on your preference, obviously I'm a morning person, so I like to work early rather than work late. But I know there's a lot of people who like to, not work early and would prefer to work late instead of working early. But I'm a big morning person, so.
Yeah, and the day ends, you probably have to go to sleep pretty soon, I'm guessing.
Well, yeah. I mean, if I'm not meeting up with friends, or if I'm not going to some sort of concert or trying a new restaurant, for example, then I'll pretty much be winding down my day around, I'd say around 8.
Yeah, I like it. Well, thank you for that. It's always good to hear about any kind of hacking, not in a CMS, but life hacking, productivity hacking. I was just at a biohacking conference a couple of weeks ago. It's a whole lot of hacking. But so we just talked about roughly 25 years of experience, 50 or so CMSs, if that, maybe even more. You're extremely well placed to tell us about the evolution of the content management system. Can you kind of walk us through, and this is going to lead up to, I think, a lot of these Universal CMS discussions and the positioning of dotCMS, but can you kind of give us a quick tour, a quick history lesson of the CMS in these roughly 25 years?
Absolutely. So if we rewind the clock all the way to, let's say, around 1995 to 1999, that era, one of the most interesting things about that time, right, is today terms that are considered potentially a little problematic, like webmaster, still existed. We were working with things like Microsoft Publisher, if you all remember that, Microsoft Front Page. Dreamweaver was just beginning to come on the scene sort of in the late 1990s to early 2000s. But I think one of the things that was really interesting about that time period is the emergence of the traditional or the old sort of static web CMS, right? The CMS really came out of a really interesting compromise that occurred. Back in those days, really the only way that you could build a website was either coding directly HTML or, a little bit later on, CSS. Using table-based layouts, obviously, using those old funky elements like the marquee and blink tags, and then transitioning gradually over to things that made those jobs a lot easier, right? A lot of us who grew up in that era and had web development experience in the late 90s and the early 2000s, it was really about using FTP tools to upload flat HTML files up into a server somewhere, right? And that was also the time period when things like the Common Gateway Interface, CGI, emerged. Perl was obviously a very big sort of thing back then. But what began to emerge around some of these interesting problems was, well, hey, our marketing teams, our content teams, those who actually work with content beyond code, want to be able to have some influence over how that content is delivered, how that content is presented, how that content is managed, right? And the CMS was really born from a very interesting time of friction between some of these organizations in the back office that said, well, hey, we can't really rely on everyone to learn HTML or everyone to learn CSS. We need to figure out some way to publish web content that makes a lot of sense. And at the time, you had a lot of these really interesting tools that were really focused on blogging, things like the advent of Blogger, for example, really led to this growth as well. But at the time, you had very simplistic blogging tools and also very simplistic discussion forum tools. If you remember things like PHP BB, that the list goes on in terms of those old bulletin board and forum tools. These were all ways to make it much easier for those who work with content, regardless of what it is, especially user-generated content, to manage all of that content and how it looks without ever having to tap on the shoulder of a developer, right? Without ever having to touch the HTML or get their hands dirty with CSS or have to understand anything about how HTML goes into the server and then goes into the browser. So one of the interesting things that came out with the static web CMS is that just as in the early history of constitutional politics in America with the writing of the Constitution, there was a great compromise or a grand compromise that occurred, right? Which was this notion that, well, hey, developers need to give up some of that control and some of that power over that HTML, over that CSS, hand that over, toss that over the hedge, so to speak, to the marketing teams and content teams working editorially with content, such that marketing teams and content teams could proceed with their brand innovation and marketing innovation and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, developers didn't want to be burdened with all these requests to add another link to the menu on the navigation or to create a new, what have you, a new, let's say, sidebar block that contains a search bar or something like that. They just wanted to proceed on doing really cool stuff with the code that they were building. So the static web CMS really occupies a very unique ecological niche in the software industry. And the reason for that is because of this compromise. Very, very few other software verticals in the tech world really exhibit this kind of characteristic, which is, well, hey, if you're going over to a tool like a CRM tool, for example, or something like an HCM tool, human capital management, or if you're going over to some other, think of some of the modern tools, right, like DAM tools or other MarTech tools. A lot of these approaches, a lot of these tools, a lot of these paradigms are really only focused on one persona, right? And that is, somebody who's like the relationship manager for the CRM, somebody who's a marketer for things like HubSpot, somebody who is potentially, doing brand management for a marketing team. But the CMS was really interesting in terms of its niche, because what the CMS does is it actually acts as a central nexus of collaboration between a whole lot of different people that have very, very different motivations and very, very different incentive structures. The static web CMS was born because marketers and developers reached a really compelling compromise where they said, okay, so we're going to be able to have control over how this content looks and how this content is presented, how this content is delivered, how this content is actually laid out and actually assembled. But developers will also have their flexibility and their ability to do whatever they want to do on the innovation side. By the same token, think about all the folks that hop into the CMS that really don't end up in the CMS every day, right? These are folks who are reviewing websites for accessibility, for instance, reviewing websites for compliance, especially when it comes to GDPR or HIPAA compliance or FedRAMP, for example, or all these things that exist now that are very important. In the healthcare industry, for instance, making sure that HIPAA compliance is followed by placing key pharmaceutical information above the fold of the page. All of these people also have to access the CMS to be able to preview potentially content that's not scheduled for a long time. Maybe a pharmaceutical company is releasing a new prescription drug or a new over-the-counter drug, and they need to review that before it goes live. So the CMS in that era was very interesting because it gave both of these parties, the content folks, which includes as an umbrella term everyone who works with content, not just marketers and content editors and authors, but also compliance officers, accessibility auditors, content strategists, everybody else. And then on the other side, the developers and architects and technologists who want to be able to innovate and build nifty new features for the website itself. The website really became a marketing product, a content product, as well as a developer product. And that's one thing that the static web CMS did super, super well, all the way up until the end, I would say, of the responsive web design era. Because if you think about it, back in those times, the responsive web design sort of revolution really got the CMSs to start thinking more about mobile. But of course, the idea was that, well, you can just do that in the same, sort of in the same page builder and the same visual builder that you have for your static website. What happened, of course, in the mid to late, I would say, 2010s, really sort of the early to mid 2010s, was the advent of what developers call Universal JavaScript back then. I mean, today it's really just known as JavaScript or full stack JavaScript. But Universal JavaScript had a really interesting proposition, which was that back in those times, a lot of the back-end code that was used to manage the server side was written in a language that could not be read or could not be executed by the browser. So think PHP, Python, Ruby, think of Java, all of these different languages that really are great on the server side, but then don't really have any influence on the client side until, of course, more recently. By the same token, you had this explosion in interactivity, this explosion in innovation that was happening in JavaScript, where people wanted to move away from the old jQuery or Ajax or DHTML paradigms that really reflected some of those old frameworks that existed. Thinking of things like Dojo, for example. jQuery is really the biggest example, however, and wanted to make their code a lot more manageable. Now, keep in mind, of course, right, that there are several what are called separations of concerns that are very crucial here. In the software world, a separation of concerns is basically the allocation of different responsibilities and roles into different aspects of code. It's a very, very key architectural concept. There's two types of separation of concerns that the early web, the static web, enforced. One was between the markup, the HTML, and the style, the CSS. Kind of like data versus presentation, but also not really, right? The second, of course, was between server versus client, right? This notion that you assemble the web page on the server side as a static web page built out in HTML, and then you push that out, you flush that out to the browser, and the browser simply displays a static web page based on that HTML. JavaScript really threw that on its head, right? Now you have jQuery touching CSS that violates the markup and style separation of concerns. You now have also, some of these concerns around server versus client being violated with the invention of Node.js. The introduction of Node.js really marks a pivotal moment in the web development world, because what Node.js allowed people to do was to straddle that separation of concerns between the client side and server side by having the same code executable both on the server side and on the client side. So you can manage your web application components, your web page components in a single code base, regardless of whether it's on the server side or on the client side. What this did, of course, is it led to a huge amount of interactivity, better performance, more asynchronous interactions on the front end, on the browser side, rather than having to go through a full page refresh or a whole server round trip to fetch new information. So Universal JavaScript is really interesting because obviously it really overturned the predominant ways in which we built web pages. And the headless CMS emerged partially as a result of this Universal JavaScript revolution, which is the notion that we should really not be doing a lot of touching of HTML. That should really be governed by JavaScript, right? Because now JavaScript is operable on the server side. The headless CMSs that emerged in the early to late mid to late 2010s and also the early 2010s really jumped on the notion of using API first architectures. And what that means is using APIs as that single layer that separates the data, which is represented by, of course, all of the content, all the data objects that need to be served out, the assets, and of course, the actual rendering of all of the web pages and web applications that need to be served out to an end user. What that really did, however, is it really chopped off in many ways and violated a lot of the trust that prior content editors and content authors and marketers who were used to that static web CMS era were really valuing and really prioritizing. The ability to assemble web pages themselves, the ability to actually build landing pages based on templates they had created, the ability to preview content across a variety of different timescales, and also on a variety of different widths and breakpoints responsively. It made it a lot harder for them to get involved in all of those prerogatives that they had had before. The headless CMS, in my opinion, was an absolutely fantastic idea for developers, right? Because it really said, developers, we hear you. We understand you don't want to be writing all of your components anymore in Python or in Ruby or whatever, or using some of these abstraction-based templating languages that are often very, very difficult to use and often very finicky and often a lot of work to learn. Now you can just use your favorite framework like React or Angular or back then Ember.js or Backbone.js, today, of course, Svelte and Astro, to do all of those things that you want to do to innovate much more quickly and also build more interactive web pages and applications. And that really enforced, I would say, a clean break in the CMS archaeology, which is that you see now that the headless CMS has had made a very strong position that developers are the first-class citizen, that marketers and content editors are really relegated solely to data entry or data management, things of that nature. And they really had no more control over the presentation layer since that was thrown over the hedge to all of the developers in the room. We see now, of course, that there is an interesting response, right? Of course, in the, I would say, mid to late 2010s and also the early 2020s, the static web CMSs or monolithic CMSs really kind of recoiled at this change and recoiled at the fact that developer experience was now dictating a lot of the migration over to the headless and now, of course, composable CMS landscape. And what these now known as hybrid headless CMSs did was they rushed to bolt on new APIs like GraphQL. They rushed to bolt on new developer ecosystems for people who wanted to build headlessly using React or using Angular and using Vue.js, for example. And in doing so, they showed that they could be headless as well. But at the same time, they didn't really have a good answer for the visual editing piece. And of course, neither do the headless CMSs in this regard, because of the fact there's that clean separation of concerns now between data and presentation, now that the other separations of concerns have been completely washed away. By jettisoning the visual editor entirely, and by saying that visual preview of every single channel or every single approach is not something that is feasible, the CMS industry really did the content editor and content author and marketer audience a little dirty. A lot of marketing teams that I speak to in the enterprise, a lot of content authors and content editors and content strategists that I speak to in the enterprise see this change as really nothing short of a betrayal. And the reason for that is because of that static web era CMS grand compromise that said, we will give you control over the presentation layer, and we will grant you that control in order for you to be able to do all of the things that you have to do for your job when it comes to the brand and when it comes to the content, as well as giving you all of the things and the tools that you need to be successful. But of course, what happens is that, as we see, with the advent of all these new frameworks that seemingly come out every single month, you have, of course, Astro and Svelte that are now being very widely used. You see, of course, this paradigm shift where the marketing teams and the content teams are really recoiling from this. And they're seeing also the threads become a little bit tangled. On this headless CMS and composable CMS side, you see marketing teams and content teams becoming very unhappy with the fact that they have to look at 15 different UIs or 15 different tabs. And you also see that the developer teams are also unhappy with the old monolithic or hybrid headless CMS models. And so this really leads to, I think, a lot of consternation on both sides, which is how do marketers regain control over every single presentation layer, especially given that developers ain't going nowhere. Developers ain't going back, right? They're going to stick with their frameworks that they love. They're going to stick with all these things that they love. but how can we make sure to restore the functionality that marketers and content editors hold dear and have long held dear ever since the advent of the CMS and the first generation of the CMS, while still allowing developers to do their best work agnostically across frameworks, and also to pivot towards the omni-channel multimodal future where we now have 15 different channels, some of which are not even visual content, but are oral content or spoken content or immersive content or extended reality content, and now, of course, even AI-generated content.
That was quite an education there. I appreciate that, and I would. It feels like we are in flight of needing some kind of new grand compromise. It's almost too. Everything you were saying there, I was like feeling political analogies, right? Like, something's put forward in legislation, and then the voters vote in the next election to say, you get away with it for the period of time until the vote comes up. But then oftentimes they vote to get you out of there. But these have long tails to them. And we're talking about enterprise businesses, which themselves don't, we use the word pivot as quickly. It's like an aircraft carrier, even upper mid-market. We talk about how often do companies actually change a system? And then the other piece that I often think about is how big is the market looking for solutions like these that we're talking about, that aren't we had joked in a post where you had written one of your really good thought pieces, and I was at a conference in New York, and it was not, it might not have been enterprise, but it was a digital marketing conference. Met a lot of people who are at real companies. The amount of them who would come up to the booth that I happened to be with, one provider, and to ask, what is a CMS? Is that like how you update Instagram? Is that like, it blows my mind because I don't feel like I'm overly immersed in it, but sometimes it blows my mind what the audience doesn't get and the levels that are going on behind the scenes when you talk through that history and evolution.
Yeah.
Like how we meet those kind of not even dueling, like quadruple.
That is an excellent point. I mean, and I want to respond to something you just said there that I think is really interesting, right? Because frankly, if you talk to a lot of marketing teams, if you talk to a lot of brand marketers, if you talk to a lot of content authors, many people don't even think of the CMS as what they're using, right? They think of Drupal or they think of WordPress. They're much more familiar with how like what the CMS they're actually using is called.
It's like a Kleenex, right? Or like one of those, what are those words called again?
Yeah, Xerox. Yeah.
Is it a?
I think eponyms is. Yeah. So no, it's a very interesting thing, and I think this really gets at some of the issues that we see, right? When people log into a system like WordPress, right? When people log into a system like Drupal, when people log into a system like some of these CMSs that have been around for a long time, like dotCMS as well, what they're expecting and what they have long seen, right, in the static web CMS era, and regardless of whether or not it was the right decision or it was an architecturally correct decision, it's there, right? You can't rewind history. The reality is that so many people that adopted CMSs at the very early stage of their digital transformation journey found that they had this unified user interface that allowed them to do all of the things that they wanted to do, and they're not willing to go away from that. And there's two notes I want to make here, which is that the headless CMSs, especially in the early days, I remember when I first started trying a headless CMS, and I'm not gonna name and shame here, but I remember I tried a CMS that had a preview integration with a hosting platform that is very popular in the headless and JavaScript space, right? But in order to use this preview integration, you had to have a developer actually install and configure that for you. You had to, and this was me putting my sort of marketing hat on, like what would this be like if I was to just enable this preview for this piece of content without the hand of a developer by my side. And, I would not only have to go to the integration and make sure it was working, but then also check that it was configured correctly in the hosting platform. And then also I would have to make sure that it was still connected because it would break, it would oftentimes fail and not really communicate very clearly why. And then the worst part is that when you clicked on that preview link, it took you to a completely new window, a completely new tab with some gobbledygook URL in the URL bar. And suddenly now I'm thinking, if I have to manage 15 different previews across 15 different points in time because I have 15 scheduled items of content and they're all embargoed at different times, I can't actually use this because I can't differentiate between all of these different gobbledygook URLs that are at the top of my browser. So this is really, I think, what gets at some of the issues around the headless and composable CMS today, which is that headless and composable CMSs are wonderful things, are absolutely fantastic things. I am a daily user of Contentful, right? I am a daily user of Netlify. I love both products, but I'm also a developer. I'm also a coder, right? I'm also somebody who really deeply understands web technology. And I talked to two really interesting folks recently that gave me some very interesting insight into their thinking. Several years ago, I did some architectural consulting. I do architectural consulting work on the side for headless CMS architectures and decoupled architectures and mock architectures, so on and so forth. And I was working with an enterprise organization in Japan. It's a name that everyone has heard of. It's a name that it's very, very large. And of course, they have many, many different brands that they have to work with, each that has their own developer team, each that has their own marketing team. And they were on a decade-long, and I'm not joking here when I say 10 to 15-year-long journey to move away from their very old monolithic CMS approach over to a more headless and JavaScript-driven approach. But here's the issue, right, is that different developer teams wanted to do different things. And also different marketing teams wanted to do different things and accomplish different things across each brand. But of course, the prerogative was that the corporation wanted to maintain the same exact underlying CMS across all of those different brands. What they did, of course, is there were some websites, some brand websites that were remaining on that old approach that was actually built in Drupal and also in WordPress. There were also some that wanted to stay on a headless Drupal architecture, but then also be able to do things with React and Angular and so on and so forth. And this company had not only a React-driven brand website, an Angular-driven brand website, but also a Vue.js-driven brand website. And it's solely because of what those individual teams wanted to do. But of course, when it came to the marketing organization across the entire company, they struggled deeply with the ability to make sure that they didn't have to train themselves on 15 different UIs or so on and so forth. They wanted to stay on a single UI for driving all of their editing and authoring capabilities. So how do you enable that when you've got folks on React, folks on Angular, folks on Vue.js, and also folks who are working on a monolithic architecture? That's a key consideration for a lot of folks who are still very early on, especially in the enterprise, in their digital transformation journeys. I spoke also recently with a former executive of a composable company in the space. And he shared with me that one of the biggest issues that's now facing composable and headless CMSs is this UX fragmentation issue, where now you're seeing as the Mock Alliance begins to gain steam and continue to gain steam, you're seeing a lot of unhappiness and dissatisfaction with the fact that you're having to use 5 or 10 or 15 different user interfaces, and you have to train up your staffs on how to use each of those different interfaces. You've got a commerce platform over here, you've got a search platform over here like Algolia, you've got some sort of a typeform thing over here. You might be using Segment, you might be using Contentful, you might be using Commerce Layer or Commerce Tools. And it becomes very, very complicated for a marketing team to understand how they can influence the brand across all of those different contexts. I also spoke recently with an enterprise organization that had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars acquiring a headless or composable CMS, thinking that they were going to get visual editing, visual preview across their headless architecture out of the box. And of course, when that vendor came back and gave them a statement of work to implement in professional services visual editing and visual preview over the course of 6 to 8 months, they weren't the happiest campers in the book, and they actually abandoned that headless CMS and went back to a monolithic architecture. So once again, I do want to stress and emphasize that headless and composable CMSs are absolutely wonderful. I use them daily. I use them all the time. They power my website. But for a lot of folks that don't have that technical heft, that know-how, they don't have a large engineering bench or a significantly skilled agency partner or consultancy partner that's helping them with that implementation, it's a very, very difficult lift for the vast majority of marketing organizations, especially as we see budgets continue to tighten and also see engineering teams continue to be asked to focus less on internal tooling and more on external-facing innovation.
Yeah, and another kind of fascinating part on that, we've had the chance at Conobos to work with several enterprises who have, while we were working with them, been acquired, and it's like it's the old school of acquisitions where it's like you're looking at the books, you're looking at how brands work. Is there a czar? Probably not the right word, but you know what I mean? You're good with words. But is there an overseer of the technology integration to the level it should? Because if you have a whale buying a whale or a bigger whale buying a whale, sometimes even the customer we had, which was acquired, had 5 or 6 of us working because at some point they took on this solution at some point, and it's it's pretty it's jarring, and it's a problem that is going to be out there seeking a solution. And I mean, for not to give an ad here, but for Conobos, it's really what we try to do is partner with some of the most used, quadrants, waves, solutions that customers will be looking at, and even pre having a customer go in and build relationships, understand the technology, so that when we get into a position where we can roadmap, we can audit, we at least are speaking from as much of not having a bias as possible, and as much as delivering for the customer what they need. And in many cases, I mean, more of, I don't want to call them monoliths, maybe they're hybrid headless, but, and we're going to get to our terminology here, which we've used a lot of, but oftentimes the solution is in front of you, and marketing stigma might make you think less of it because a monolith said so, and you almost have to re-educate. No, it's enough, and it doesn't mean you're lesser than to use it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's, it's very interesting you say that, because I think there's a very interesting, I would say, positioning I see, or sort of legacy approach I see to, communicating to folks that, their monolithic approach or their hybrid headless approach is somehow antiquated, right? But the fact of the matter is that you would be very, I think a lot of folks would be very surprised to learn that there are many enterprise companies that have only just barely adopted a CMS, right? These are folks that were using some of the most amazing 90s technologies, using Perl to drive stuff, using FTP to drive stuff, and they've only just recently made the transition to using a CMS to manage all of their content. And so a lot of these folks are people that are just as valid, and are people that are just as important in terms of how they want to deliver content. And they see, of course, the value in a CMS, and they see the value in having these monolithic architectures as well. My argument has always been, right, and I have always believed that no matter who or what stage of digital transformation any organization is in, they are completely valid in where they are, and they're completely valid if they want to in staying where they are. And to see some of the, I would say this doesn't come from a lot of people, right? But I think there is a certain level of pejorativeness that we treat some of these folks as being, sort of old hat or legacy, and why don't you move to a headless architecture already, or why don't you move to, something already? And we forget that in many verticals, right, in many industries, if you think about financial services in particular, if you think about aviation, right, if you think about healthcare, if you think about just some of these industries that really rely very deeply on interactions with tooling that might be very, very old, or very, very much things that are still very stable, but they still have to be able to interact in a deep way with some older integrations or older tools. We saw this a whole lot at Oracle, right? They are just as valid. They are not people who are behind. They are not people. They have reasons for why they are the way they are. There's a reason why they haven't moved to the cloud, and they usually have good motivations for doing so, right? There's a reason they haven't moved to headless, and there are usually really good motivations and rationales for not doing so.
Absolutely, and that's what, like, really relationship and connection and consultation needs to be about. Is, they always like to say meeting the customer where they are, right? In the kind of sayings thing, I always like to look at the continuum between transaction and transformation. And I always feel like you want to be transformational and less transactional. You want to be a wealth management fund as opposed to a day trader, and things will end up well. There's space in transformation for transaction. I don't think there's as much space for transformation within transaction. But what I want to do here, because I think we could go on for like a Joe Rogan level podcast here, which is great. And I know I have you for a little bit more hooked in here. Usually we like to explain these terminology items, but I think in your build up of kind of the history of CMS, you hit the headless and composable. Let's talk about Universal CMS, what that is, and perhaps how headless and composable inform what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think in many ways that the terms that we have been seeing a lot in the CMS industry have become a little bit worn out, which is very common in the technology world. I remember when services-oriented, microservices, all of those terms also became, sort of old hat as well. And also hybrid headless is I see it as becoming a little bit tired in terms of how people are reacting to it, how people are looking at it. And the rationale for why this paradigm is really becoming clear. I see very, very clear trends pointing in the direction of this. But for many months now, I've been writing about, and also for years, I've been speaking about the need for us to restore an equilibrium in the CMS world that honors every single person that touches the CMS. As I shared before, the CMS is a really unique piece of software because it really occupies that central location, that central locus where every single person who's involved in content can interact with content in a very deep way, regardless of whether you're a developer or an editor. The Universal CMS is really about restoring the balance between the editors and developers and everyone who touches content, regardless of what the architecture is, regardless of what technology is on the front end, regardless of what framework you're using, regardless of the channel that you're serving content to. And this is really crucial because what this is really a moonshot mission. And it's very funny because just a few months ago, I learned that our friend Dean Barker over at Optimizely has been talking about for many months as well what he calls the race to the middle, which is this phenomenon that we're seeing with both headless and monolithic or hybrid headless CMSs, where the headless and composable CMSs are now racing to build visual editing and visual preview capabilities. We've seen announcements come out about studio products, studio offerings from a lot of the bigger headless CMSs. We see positioning changes. For example, React Bricks recently changed their positioning to the point where they're a headless CMS with visual editing for React. And the hybrid headless players are now also, now that their API stories, now that their web services stories, now that their REST API and GraphQL stories have matured, they're now really leaning into a lot of the developer ecosystems that headless and composable CMSs have done really well, and the integrations as well. And I was very lucky when I was at Acquia to work on some of the very first sort of phases in this direction. I worked with an amazing team to build out the first ever, headless Drupal developer ecosystem consisting of various command line interfaces and software development kits and so on and so forth. And what we see now is that there's a really interesting convergent evolution happening right now, where the headless CMS is trying to become more manipulable and more usable by the content editing and content authoring audience through visual editing. And the monolithic or hybrid headless CMS is rushing to become more favorable and more amenable to the demands and the exigencies of developers who love working with JavaScript. By the same token, however, there's several other parallel changes that are happening that are very interesting to watch. And this is really where the convergent evolution that I just spoke of matches exactly up with what Dean Barker has shared around the race to the middle. And that is the fact that we're now seeing a huge explosion in channels, what I call the channel explosion, which is, I referred to it previously as a Cambrian explosion, so to speak. But the universal CMS of the future, right? Yes, it needs to restore the power that the static web CMS gave to marketing teams and content teams. But it has to do so along two different axes and two different dimensions. Namely, number one, the framework axis, which means no longer is flat HTML or some convoluted abstraction above a monolithic CMS enough. It has to be able to be something that can be manipulated as a website in a CMS, regardless of whether it was built in Next.js, Vue.js, React, Nuxt.js, ViewPress, Gridsome, Gatsby, Astro, Svelte, the list goes on. And also along the second dimension, which is omnichannel, multimodal, cross-device, right? Because content today is no longer just visual. It's no longer just written. It's no longer just textual, as we saw in the static web era. Content is now also destined for mobile devices and for digital signs, for set-top boxes, OTT applications, for extended reality headsets, for voice bots and chat bots. And here's the thing, content is also no longer written. It's no longer textual, which means it's also oral, it's spoken, like voice bots, right? It's also something that's immersive and spatial, like you see in extended reality. So how do we actually make sure that there are ways for people who work with the CMS to be able to audit, respect compliance for, preview, embargo, schedule, observe, track content that is destined for all of these different that is destined for all of these different channels, and also is destined for a slew of different website frameworks as well. And this is the true moonshot mission. This is the true challenge, right? This is the mission to Mars, right? If folks have seen For All Mankind, right? This is the way that the CMS world needs to head, and that is to restore the promise and the greatness of the static web CMS era as that collaboration nexus for marketers, developers, compliance auditors, accessibility specialists, content strategists, lawyers, what have you, right? And also doing so for every single channel that's here. The thing that's great, though, is a lot of work has already been done in this regard, right? A lot of things are already pointing in the right direction. I wrote a blog post about 4 or 5 years ago where I shared that JavaScript is now not only the de facto language of web applications writ large across both the server side and client side, it is also now the de facto language for applications beyond the web. You now see, of course, frameworks like Babylon.js for WebXR, 3.js, for example, for immersive and spatial content emerging on the scene. You also see approaches now where web renderable previews are being generated and built for things that aren't visual content. For example, taking a voice bot that's destined for an Amazon Echo somewhere or a Google Home somewhere, and actually rendering that in a visual way so that it can be previewed within the context of the website, right? Also, you see cross-platform frameworks emerging, like React Native and Flutter, through middleware like Expo, where they can actually take a native mobile application that normally is compiled into an APK file and then actually render that as a web application directly within a CMS preview. But the most exciting for me, because I love to talk about stuff really far in the future, is the fact that now the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, is working on very clear standards around WebXR, which is, of course, web-based extended reality. For those who remember way back in the day, I don't know, this might actually date me and reveal my age, but I remember back in the day when you had VRML, right, virtual reality HTML, or sorry, markup language, alongside XML, alongside SGML, the predecessor of HTML. That was a very exciting time. And now we're seeing that hype curve come back when it comes to extended reality and XR-driven interfaces. But these are all places that content is headed, right? Of course, now you see digital signage being driven by JavaScript. You see Roku applications being driven by JavaScript. And now that that sort of standardization is happening, it's a lot easier for CMSs to imagine and also to realize this sort of approach, which is universal visual building and editing for those marketers, for those content authors, for those content editors, preview for everyone who has to audit that content, review it for compliance, review it for accessibility, and also all of the different channels that we work with today and the frameworks that we work with today. And that's why I say that the Universal CMS is really about not just restoring that previous sort of state that we were in, it is the next generation, the future state of the CMS, because it restores us to a point where both developers, both marketers, everyone who is involved in content is able to be a first-class citizen again and exert that control. Headless first, composable on top if you need it, but also omnichannel, multimodal, and tech agnostic. That's the CMS of the future, the Universal CMS, because ultimately what we do with content is about serving people who consume that content. And we also need to value the people who work with that content day in and day out. The marketing teams, the brand teams, the compliance teams, the accessibility teams, the developer teams, the engineering teams. We all are in this together to make sure that our content serves the right people. Because that's the reason that we're in content in the first place, right?
It sounded like I approve of this message type of thing. I like it. But I'm going to ask one more here. that I think ties in what the next slide was going to be about. I'm going to jump over one. So let's talk about, when you were speaking of the Universal CMS, I've also noticed leadership. I think your CEO has been talking about it a lot. It's probably a big part of your vision, matching the vision of what dotCMS can potentially be as a platform. Am I right in that? And when you look at like things like ICP or market positioning, are we in a world where the idea of the Universal CMS is kind of merging into what a dotCMS is hoping to become or be?
It's a fantastic question. As mentioned earlier, I just joined dotCMS 4 months ago, and I would be remiss not to mention that key factoid. I do want to preface this by saying that obviously the Universal CMS writ large is something I've noticed across the entire industry. It's not just something that's limited to either segment of the CMS market. It's something that, I think has been validated by a lot of folks, clearly has been validated actually by a lot of folks in the headless and composable segment, as well as in the hybrid headless segment. This is not unique to dotCMS, right? It's sort of a shared mission. It's something that I see as a rallying cry for those of us in the CMS world who are struggling really with a lot of these issues, where we see marketers who are unhappy, we see developers who are unhappy, and how do we serve both audiences in a way that pushes the entire industry forward? That said, dotCMS is certainly aiming at leading the charge here. We just reached general availability for what we call our Universal Visual Editor. The eventual goal of the Universal Visual Editor is to straddle not only monolithic and headless approaches to serving content, but also to be technology agnostic, meaning that you can use it with React or Angular or Vue.js, but also cross-channel and omni-channel. So you can use it with React Native, potentially in the future WebXR, a lot of things that are coming down the pipeline. And these are all things that I think are really exciting challenges for dotCMS, right? Our ICP has not really changed. I think that it continues to be, enterprise customers who need a really excellent multi-tenant, multi-site website with excellent CMS capabilities, an excellent API story, excellent SDK story for headless applications, and also need that visual editing and visual preview piece. So, for that, I definitely think that, we are moving in the right direction at dotCMS. And as far as our positioning goes, we are definitely aboard the Universal CMS train. I mean, we are, I think that terms like hybrid headless, terms like monolithic, terms like headless, terms like composable are really beginning to show their age, and also are beginning to see a lot more, I would say, skepticism from a lot of folks who are CMS buyers. Because they shroud sometimes a lot of the challenges therein, whether that challenge is borne by the developer or that challenge is borne by the marketing team. And so Universal CMS is actually, it's kind of like, the approach I see with Universal CMS is eventually, I think it's just going to be a CMS, right? I think it's just going to be CMS, because the goal of Universal CMS is for us to take away the word universal and for it to just become CMS in the same way that JavaScript has just become, JavaScript without the adjective universal, because it's just assumed that the CMS is inherently and intrinsically tech agnostic, framework agnostic, omni-channel, multimodal, cross-device.
That's very good. And after all of these very smart discussions, the one question I always like to ask, not if you went back to when you were 15, what would you tell yourself in this case, but if you're at a coffee place, if you're at a cocktail party, you're completely out of context of industry, just with other professionals. They ask you, what do you do? How do you explain that succinctly?
Oh, wow. Well, it's a good question, and I'll also use this time to plug shamelessly a few things. But I would first and foremost say that I am a writer, right? I am a writer of ideas and expressing ideas in ways that people can understand. And it's very interesting because I look at my past books that I've written, and I've written books that are for a developer audience, for an architect audience. I've written books that are for a designer audience, for an accessibility audience, for a content strategist or content designer audience. And the way that I have to write for those audiences is very, very different. So that's first and foremost how I would describe myself. Because there are other, just like the fact that hybrid headless and composable are starting to become a little tired. there are also other terms that are starting to become a little tired, like thought leader and content creator, and so on and so forth. So, but absolutely. And I think that if you want to read my writing, I do write pretty much on a weekly or more than weekly cadence on my blog. That's Preston.so. You can also get in touch with me on LinkedIn or at preston.so/contact. And also you can check out my books published by various folks. And also join us at the Universal CMS Summit in Montreal in August. That's on Monday, August 5th in Montreal. And very excited to participate in that. I'll be a keynote speaker. There's also a lot of other folks who will be keynoting and presenting as well. Folks from companies that we all know and love, like Crown Peak and HighGraph and Typo3 and Magnolia and so on and so forth. So,
Well, Preston, this was phenomenal. My two favorite job titles I had that show age were web producer and interactive marketing coordinator. So
I love those.
We do appreciate you in all of your titles, and for your hour here, this was great, and we'll continue the conversation. Maybe we can go back into the after this, we can go back into the thread, put some of those writings, some of those connections, and let's keep the conversation going. Thanks so much for joining the DX Community Cafe.
Thanks for having me.